Hey guys, tonight we step into the chilly, misty air of a medieval morning market. Mud squelching beneath your feet, smoke coiling from nearby braziers, and the unmistakable scent of livestock ale and unwashed humanity hanging like a damp curtain over everything. You blink through the gray, the fog thick enough to hide a goat until it headbutts your knee. Stall awnings flap lazily in the breeze. Somewhere nearby, someone is either baking or burning bread. It's impossible to tell. You shift to the side just in time to avoid a cartwheel rolling off on its own. A small child sprints after it, laughing. A man with a pot belly and a robe that might once have been white stands beside a cage, enthusiastically shouting, "Finest ferrets in Kent, good for vermin, warmth, and ticklish companionship." The ferrets themselves look unimpressed. You pause, trying to decide if it's weirder that he's selling them in pairs, or that he's offering a free burlap sack for discreet travel. This is not your polished Renaissance fare. This is the real deal, and frankly, you probably won't survive this. Between the questionable food safety laws, absence of antibiotics, and the occasional sword-related misunderstanding, your odds are better sleeping through this video. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, post your location and what time it is where you're listening. I love seeing where everyone's dozing off from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge past a stall selling lumpy turnips and get distracted by a woman loudly advertising something called pottage on a stick. It's gray, it wobbles, and it might actually be moving. Next to her is a man stirring a wooden vat labeled Authentic River Water Ale, which you decide not to investigate further. Markets in medieval Europe weren't just about buying and selling. They were chaotic centers of news gossip, religious fervor, strange performances, and occasionally low-grade violence involving cheeses, depending on where and when you landed. 12th century London, 14th century Bruges, or a sleepy hill village in France, you might stumble across anything from wandering monks to a guy juggling apples while quoting the Bible. Badly. The ground is thick with straw to soak up waste animal and otherwise, and every few feet someone seems to be relieving themselves discreetly behind a cart or not so discreetly into a communal ditch. You're starting to regret your choice of sandals. Across the square, a rooster escapes from a crate, flapping furiously. A teenager runs after it, tripping over a pig. The pig squeals, someone yells, "Thief," out of habit, and suddenly 3 different people are chasing 3 different animals, none of which belong to them. And yet somehow, this is business as usual. Medieval markets often began before sunrise. By the time the sun barely peeks over the rooftops, the space is alive with shouts, haggles, and the occasional bagpipe. Vendors would set up their wooden stalls or lay cloths directly on the ground. The wealthier merchants had booths with awnings. The poorer ones sold turnips out of baskets or squatted beside their goods with a tired, vaguely suspicious stare. Animals roamed freely. Dogs, cats, chickens, even cows wandered among the people. One historical account from 13th century Paris describes a goat stealing a merchant's glove and leading several children on a gleeful chase into a church. That probably made Mass a bit more memorable. You're nudged aside by a woman carrying 3 live eels in a bucket. "Move, love," she says kindly. The eels peer up at you, unimpressed. She disappears into the throng, leaving behind a trail of water and the faint scent of brine. Markets weren't just about commerce, they were enforced, structured events. In most towns, you couldn't just throw down a table and start selling. Charters granted by kings or lords authorized market days, determined who could sell, and even set prices for basic goods like bread, salt, and ale. You notice a wooden sign nailed to a pole that reads in Latin something about market ordinances. There's a crude drawing of a man being hit with a stick. Subtle. Historians still argue whether these markets truly democratized trade or simply reinforced the power of guilds and wealthy merchants. But for the average peasant or villager, market day was the one time you could glimpse the wider world, at some imported cloth, hear news from other towns, or sell off your surplus cabbages to fund your annual soap splurge. Speaking of soap, you spot a man selling cubes of something that might be soap, but also might be cheese. He offers you a sniff. You decline. He shrugs and pops a piece into his mouth. Okay, definitely cheese. Maybe. You move along, dodging a puddle of something suspiciously shiny. The air grows thicker with smells: smoke, sweat, cooked meat, wet wool, and what you swear is vinegar and honey mixed together. You pass by a perfumer's stand, which offers unicorn musk in a tiny vial. The vendor winks. You raise an eyebrow. He shrugs. It's mostly lavender and lies, etan, he admits. At another stall, a woman offers to read your fortune with a handful of chicken bones. You glance at the bones, then at the chicken pecking crumbs beside her. She notices your hesitation. He volunteers, she says. A boy runs by with a tray of pies balanced on his head, yelling, hot meat, which sounds more like a warning than an invitation. You don't stop him. You do stop when you hear a man next to you whisper, "Don't eat the gray ones." You turn to ask why, but he's already vanished into the crowd. The market is teeming with textures and movement. One stall has bolts of fabric stacked high, dyed in hues of indigo saffron and bloodroot red. Another offers polished wooden toys, mostly animals on wheels, and a surprisingly realistic duck that quacks when pulled. You pause at a small table where a man has lined up dozens of tiny bones. Not human, hopefully. He's arranging them into little figurines. Skeleton chess, he says proudly. Best played at funerals. Even the church has a presence here. A friar stands on a small box preaching about sin and temptation, though he stops mid-sentence to buy a meat skewer. Priorities. And through it all, the clamor continues. Bells ringing, donkeys braying, someone tuning a hurdy-gurdy in the distance. You begin to feel the rhythm of it, the madness and method. Medieval markets weren't clean, but they were alive, full of risk-noise scams and wonder. Just watch your pouch. Someone's already eyeing it. You finally manage to edge away from the skeletal chess enthusiast, only to stumble straight into a bread stall. The table is covered in loaves of various shapes and shades, from pale flour-dusted rounds to hunks of dense brownish-black barley bricks that could easily double as medieval self-defense weapons. The baker, a red-cheeked woman with forearms like battering rams, sees you eyeing the selection and grins wide enough to reveal a gaping gap where 3 front teeth should be. "Fresh baked this mornin'," she declares, smacking a loaf so hard it puffs out a tiny cloud of flour like it just sneezed. "Rye oat and God's mercy." "What'll it be?" You're about to ask the price when she holds out a calloused hand, palm up. 3 farthings. You freeze. What even is a farthing? This, unfortunately, is your first encounter with the absolute mess that is medieval currency. You dig into your coin pouch, a soft leather purse that might once have held marbles, and start pulling out round lumpy discs, trying to identify which ones are actual money and which ones are possibly buttons. Some of the coins have faces, some just have crosses or cryptic Latin inscriptions. One has a hole drilled through it, possibly for threading onto a string, or possibly because someone got very bored. "Is this one a farthing?" you ask, holding up what looks suspiciously like a washer. The baker squints. "That's half a groat cut with shears. Not legal here since Michaelmas." You nod, trying to pretend that makes any sense. Currency in the Middle Ages was a confusing patchwork of regional systems, counterfeit coins, clipped edges, and wildly fluctuating values. One village might accept English pennies, but the next over might insist on Florentine florins or some obscure local token that looks like a melted oyster. Coins were often cut in halves or quarters to make small change, which meant money could jingle around your pouch like a jigsaw puzzle from hell. Historians still argue whether the chaos of local currencies encouraged more barter or simply made people really, really good at mental math. Either way, it's no wonder people resorted to trading eggs for needles or offering to mend a cloak in exchange for a bit of salt and gossip. Eventually, the baker takes pity on you and accepts what she calls a face coin and a whisper's worth of silver. You're not sure if that's real currency or just medieval sarcasm, but she hands you a warm, rough-textured loaf in return. You take a bite and immediately understand why she still has most of her molars. This bread fights back. It's hearty, chewy, and tastes vaguely of smoke and survival. Next to the bread stall, a thin man in a patched tunic is carefully arranging coins on a cloth, some silver, some copper, some possibly chocolate. A sign reads, "Money weighed. Trade smoothed, curses lifted." He beckons you over. Exchange rates for every kingdom unless it's Tuesday. Or raining. You decide to move on before he starts speaking in riddles. You wander down a narrow path between stalls and find yourself in what might generously be called the dairy district. A row of barrels is filled with suspiciously gray butter, curdled cream, and cheeses so aged they've begun to develop opinions. A cheesemonger, arms crossed, watches you with the same intensity you reserve for people hovering too close to your snacks. "Goat cow or surprise?" he asks. "Surprise." He shrugs. "Wasn't labeled. Been in the cellar since Candlemas." Some folks say it hums. You pass, choosing instead to explore a more aromatic booth selling herbs and dried flowers. A young girl in a crown of rosemary holds up a bundle of lavender. Smells nicer than the pigs she offers helpfully. She's not wrong. Just beyond her, a group of swine are jostling in a makeshift pen, snorting and rolling gleefully in what you hope is just mud. A large man in a sleeveless jerkin tries to auction them off with rhyming insults. "One sow, 2 sow, fat and pink and smells like you, now bid." You slip past him into a quieter alleyway, where a row of stalls offers baked goods, spiced nuts, and an alarming number of items labeled Figgy. Figgy rolls figgy paste, Figgy Surprise. It's the fig equivalent of a Taylor Swift album drop. You pick up a figgy biscuit, and immediately a child appears beside you and says, "That'll cost 2 prayers and a copper." She grins. You blink. She vanishes. It's not just money that's confusing in this market. There's a whole culture of informal trade and honor codes that would put a modern cryptocurrency network to shame. Market customs often relied on spoken deals, shared understandings, and trust, though how much trust exactly depended heavily on whether anyone was watching. Punishments for cheating were, let's say, creative. In some towns, a dishonest merchant could be nailed by the ear to their own stall. In others, they were paraded around with their false weights tied around their neck. You notice a dusty sign nailed to a post that reads, "He who lies about the loaf shall bite wood instead." Beneath it, a suspiciously tooth-marked plank hangs on a rope. Okay then. While you're digesting that, a small procession goes past a guild of bakers carrying a symbolic loaf the size of a wheelbarrow. They're accompanied by a child dressed as Saint Honoratus, the patron saint of baking, who is clearly just here for the snacks. Someone in the crowd throws a bun and hits a juggler in the face. Cheers erupt. A chicken joins the parade. No one questions it. You pause to take another bite of your bread and suddenly realize someone is watching you. A scrawny teen with a rag slung over one shoulder is eyeing your loaf like it's treasure. You break off a piece and hand it to him. He accepts wordlessly, then sprints off into the crowd. You blink, slightly dazed, and wonder if that was a good deed, a bad investment, or just Tuesday. Nearby, an old woman is selling little bags of powdered eggs. Travel food, she explains. Just add water and sort of regret. Next to her is a man selling pickled quail eggs from a wagon that doubles as his bed. He offers you one with a wink. You shake your head. He shrugs and eats it himself, shell and all. You pass another stand offering blessed bread, allegedly sanctified by a traveling monk with a tendency to bless anything that didn't run away. It's only slightly more expensive than the unblessed version, but you notice a pigeon eyeing the loaves with unholy interest. As you finish your own notably unblessed loaf, you can't help but feel oddly satisfied. Yes, your mouth is dry, your jaw is sore, and you still don't fully understand what a groat is. But in this chaotic maze of smells, shouts, and questionable choices, you've successfully acquired food. For a medieval market, that's a win. With your molars still recovering from medieval rye bread, you wander deeper into the marketplace where the soundscape shifts. Gone are the clinks of coins and hawking cries of bakers. Here it's louder, more chaotic, and oddly melodic. You turn a corner, and there it is. The meat and fish section. The first thing that hits you isn't the sight, but the smell. It's a tidal wave of brine, blood, salt smoke, and something faintly metallic, like someone marinated a penny. You instinctively inhale through your mouth, which turns out to be worse, because now it tastes like someone smuggled a cod into your brain. A shrill voice cuts through the morning air. 6 herrings for a penny, gutted, slapped, and sung over by Wednesday. You spin around to find a broad-shouldered woman in a sea-stained apron standing behind an impressive mountain of fish. Her sleeves are rolled to her elbows, and her forearms gleam with scales. She wields a gutting knife with the same energy as a gladiator entering the arena. "Don't look at me like that," she barks. "They're fresh, caught 'em myself. Mostly. Maybe." This is your first encounter with a fishwife, one of the loudest, most colorful fixtures of the medieval market. These women were known for their booming voices, aggressive sales pitches, and truly creative use of insults. Fishwives were the original hype men, street performers, and stand-up comics rolled into one, with a slight bonus of always smelling faintly of halibut. As you watch, she slaps a fish onto a buyer's hand like it's a high five. Another woman nearby retorts with a loud cackle and yells, "Your cod smells like a bishop's boot." The two begin a cheerful insult war that escalates to the point where a small crowd gathers to cheer them on. Someone throws a turnip. Just a few stalls down, the vibe changes dramatically. A butcher, sleeves stained red and apron stiff with age and questionable fluids, is serenading his display of pork cuts in a surprisingly gentle baritone. "O hawk of ham, my morning star, your marbled grace none can par." You stare. He's holding a sausage like a microphone. Been singing to him for years, he tells you, noticing your expression. Meat hears love, keeps it tender. Historians still argue whether such singing actually happened in marketplaces, or if this is the kind of romantic nonsense added to records by clerks with too much time and not enough daylight. But hey, the vibe's great, and the customers seem into it. One woman drops a coin in a jug and requests the Ballad of the Lamb Shank. You wander past another butcher who's carving a goose with precision that borders on surgical. His stall boasts meats. You recognize beef, lamb, rabbit, and some you don't. "Is that a hedgehog?" you ask, pointing at something roasted and spiky. "Delicacy," he grins, "stewed with dandelions. For special days." You nod slowly and back away. In the medieval world, what ended up on your plate had everything to do with class, location, and sheer luck. Fish was a staple, especially inland, where preservation methods like salting and smoking kept it edible longer than nature intended. Meat was more of a luxury, especially the good stuff. But in the marketplace, you could find everything from venison illegal, unless you were nobility, but you know a friend of a friend, to pigeons, boar, and yes, even peacocks. Roasted, re-feathered, and posed dramatically like a dinner centerpiece with a side of judgment. A boy wanders past with a basket full of eggs. You notice one has a tiny hole poked in it. He sees you staring, winks and mimes sniffing something foul. "Snake inside," he whispers and disappears into the crowd. You're starting to suspect half this market is performance art. A stall to your right displays pickled eels, preserved frogs, and a surprisingly large number of snails. For sauces, the vendor explains. Or beauty rituals. You nod like that helps. One fact often glossed over in textbooks: medieval markets weren't always about what you could afford. They were also about what you dared to buy. There was no FDA, no refrigeration, and definitely no vegan labeling. Labels, in fact, were optional and often hand-scribbled. One sign reads, "Lamb?" included. You overhear a conversation between two women about the merits of boiled ox tongue versus the inside bits of a duck. The phrase "gizzard gravy" is used without irony. A young man nearby gags audibly. He's chased off with a dried herring. Interestingly, markets also had their share of fake foods. Yes, food fraud is nothing new. Some butchers would soak meat in animal blood to make it seem fresher. Fish could be rescented using herbs. One record even mentions the practice of carving old meat into new shapes and disguising it with sauces and spices. Meat masquerade. You eye a suspiciously red rabbit haunch and decide not to ask. Next to a pile of smoked mackerel, you find a woman balancing baskets of dried seaweed on her head. For stew, for spells, and for constipation, she calls. A man selling barrels of salted cod interrupts her pitch by shouting, "That seaweed's so dry it went to confession." She flips him off with a piece of kelp. It's like a sitcom you can't stop watching. You briefly consider sampling the smoked trout, but then a vendor shouts, "Buy now, maggots free," and you lose your appetite. In the middle of the lane, an old man stirs a bubbling vat with a wooden paddle. He grins at you, revealing exactly 2 teeth. "Soup," he says proudly. "What kind?" "All the kinds." You smile politely and back away again. Carefully. Food regulation did exist in a loose sense. Some towns had market inspectors who would check weight's freshness and whether anyone was trying to pass off rat meat as something classier. But enforcement was hit or miss. Often, it depended on bribes, favoritism, or whether the inspector had already eaten breakfast. Historians still debate whether these food stalls genuinely improved city life, or were just thinly veiled health hazards with better marketing. What's clear is that for the average person, the market was where your next meal came from, and whether it made you stronger or sick was a coin toss you didn't always get to choose. You step aside to let a pig walk by unaccompanied, collarless, but clearly on a mission. A man chases after it, yelling, "That's my dinner!" The pig squeals back in protest. Nearby, a woman flips dried sardines like playing cards while humming a tune about salty sailors and their pickled legs. She has no stall, just a woven mat and a glint in her eye. You pause at a final meat stall where a man in a feathered cap is slicing slivers of something pink and slightly shiny. "What's that?" you ask. "Definitely not cat," he says far too quickly. You don't ask again. Instead, you retreat toward the edge of the meat zone, ears still ringing with fishwife banter, and your shirt newly decorated with what may or may not be goose grease. You don't know what you'll dream about tonight, but it's likely to involve sausage-based lullabies and fish that can shout. You haven't even gotten to the pies yet. You head down a slightly quieter path, your ears still ringing from the combined forces of singing butchers and eel-wielding fishwives, when the scent of pastry suddenly cuts through the chaos like a knife through soft cheese. You follow it, half-drawn, half-dragged by your stomach, and soon find yourself in a section of the market where steam curls lazily from ovens and rows of warm pies wink invitingly from wooden carts. Ah yes, the medieval meat pie, mysterious, hearty, and almost certainly containing something you didn't ask for. A stocky woman in a soot-streaked bonnet waves you over with a flour-covered hand. Hot pies, game beef fowl, or surprise. Come warm your hands and tempt your gut. You peer into the rows of steaming crusts. What's in the surprise one, you ask cautiously. She shrugs. Whatever didn't move fast enough this morning. You blink. She winks. It's unclear if she's joking. The truth is, in medieval markets, mystery meat pies weren't just a culinary curiosity. They were the logical result of limited refrigeration, seasonal availability, and an admirable lack of squeamishness. A pie could contain beef, rabbit, pigeon, goose, or, well, any protein source not currently someone's pet. They were portable, relatively shelf-stable, and the pastry crust doubled as a preservative barrier. Whether or not you were supposed to eat the crust often depended on your class, your hunger, and how many teeth you had left. One popular pie among the working class was made of a mixture called umbles, basically the less glamorous parts of animals: heart, liver, kidneys, and intestines. Yep, that's where we get the phrase, eating humble pie. You chew thoughtfully on a meat pie that might contain exactly that. It's oddly peppery, possibly feline. As you try to swallow discreetly, a man walks by arguing with a merchant about something called the badger tax. You edge closer because frankly, that sounds too weird to ignore. You can't charge me again, the man protests. I already paid for 3 pelts and the right to trap 'em past the creek. The merchant, a bearded, stooped figure in robes far too grand for a pelt seller, waves a scroll. You paid the pelt tax, not the tail tax. Different item, different scroll. You step back, amused and intrigued. The badger tax, it turns out, isn't completely fictional. In many parts of medieval Europe, local lords and guilds imposed all kinds of extremely specific levies. If you trapped animals, used certain fishing spots, or gathered firewood from particular forests, you could be taxed for the materials, the use of the land, the act of transportation, and sometimes bizarrely, the tools used in the gathering. One 14th century document references a squirrel fee for those who harvested acorns on royal land. Another mentions a lantern fine for night market visits. Historians still argue whether these hyper-specific taxes were genuine civic policies or just thinly disguised extortion by bored clerks. But they made for excellent stories. And arguments. So many arguments. You munch the rest of your pie as a cart passes with a hand-painted sign reading, "Pies of Enduring Mystery." It's being pulled by a donkey wearing a crown. No one seems to question this. Next to a fire pit, a group of men are huddled around a table covered in dough and feathers. One of them waves you over. Want to see a magpie bake? You raise a skeptical eyebrow. Turns out, he means an actual pie made with magpies' small black and white birds that were apparently plentiful and edible enough to end up on the medieval menu. 4 and 20 blackbirds wasn't just a nursery rhyme, it was culinary real estate. He lifts the crust on a half-finished pie to reveal the tiny legs of several magpies poking upward like Gothic party favors. You try not to scream. Meanwhile, a woman next door offers a vegetarian option onion parsnip leeks, and something she proudly calls marrow surprise. You don't ask what kind of marrow. For the wealthier classes, meat pies were elaborate affairs often shaped into castles, ships, or scenes of battle. Yes, really. Some noble feasts featured pies with live birds that would fly out when the crust was cut open. Nothing says bon appetit like a startled pigeon in your soup. You imagine someone trying to pull that off in this market. A man next to you sneezes into a pigeon. You decide that's close enough. Beyond the pie stalls, you discover another world of wrapped and skewered delicacies. Roasted hedgehogs again. Meatballs on sticks. Something labeled crane nuggets. You hope that's a joke. You hope very hard. A small girl tugs your sleeve. "Want a pie charm?" she asks, holding up a necklace made of tiny crusts. Lucky if you eat it during thunder. You gently decline, mostly because one of the crusts appears to be moldy and whispering. The pies here don't come with nutrition labels, obviously, and food safety is... Well, let's just say loosely enforced. In the corner, a man sharpens a cleaver on a whetstone while talking about last week's lark incident. You don't inquire further. The meat pie, while suspicious, was the cornerstone of many medieval meals. It was cheap filling and didn't require a full set of dinnerware. Plus, you could carry it in your pocket if needed, though it might leave a smear that looked a bit too murdery. That's why most people carried cloths or waxed paper, or just didn't care. You bite into a second pie, this one labeled apple and eel. It's not terrible, sweet and oily, like a cinnamon roll that made bad life choices. A group of apprentices nearby argue over which pie will give them better luck on their exams. One swears by mutton, another by chicken liver, and the third insists on a weekly helping of Abbott's pie made with eggs, prunes, and a secret ingredient no one's allowed to name. You imagine modern students doing the same. I only eat goat spleen pie before finals. It opens the mind. A bell rings nearby midday toll. You realize you've spent the better part of the morning watching people yell about pie ingredients, but no one's rushed. This is how markets worked. They were social. They were slow. They were the medieval version of scrolling through food TikTok, full of surprises, drama, and an unsettling number of birds. You pass a cart where a man sells nothing but crust. For soup lids and roof repair, he says. His beard is crusted too, possibly edible. As you leave the pie section, your stomach full and your curiosity mostly satisfied, you hear a scuffle near the fishmonger's again. Apparently, someone tried to pay for 3 pies with a saint's toenail. You don't even blink, because here, that somehow makes sense. You make your way toward a cluster of stalls that look less like places of commerce and more like the chaotic leftovers of a traveling carnival. There's a sudden change in the crowd. The people here aren't pushing to buy or sell, they're huddled, whispering, laughing in low conspiratorial tones. One woman wears a scallop shell necklace and clutches a walking staff. Another man, draped in a long brown cloak, clutches a pouch and speaks in hushed Latin to himself. Pilgrims. Or at least, that's what they claim to be. From Canterbury, one announces to a crowd with holy water, blessed by Thomas Becket's ghost himself. The water, suspiciously murky, is being sold in reused ale bottles. A small boy next to you mutters, "He said he was from Walsingham yesterday." Welcome to the Relics section of the market, the medieval equivalent of a timeshare seminar, mixed with a yard sale for spiritual favors. These stalls don't sell food or tools or cloth. They sell protection, absolution, and the occasional deeply questionable feather that apparently fell from an angel's wing. You step closer to one merchant's table covered in worn parchment, yellowed cloth strips, and a small wooden box with genuine hair of the Virgin Mary painted in sloppy red ink. Next to it is a tiny vial labeled "Sweat of a Martyr." A teenage girl leans over and whispers, "That's just water from the town bathhouse." The merchant glares at her. She shrugs. Relics in the medieval world were big business. And not just the official kind, kept under lock and key in churches and monasteries. These markets were crawling with miracle bits, saint bones, splinters from the true cross, and even breadcrumbs from the Last Supper served on very questionable trenchers. Historians still argue whether these relics were truly believed in by the masses, or just an accepted part of the economic and spiritual theater of the time. Was it faith, desperation, or just really good marketing? After all, it's easier to sell salvation when your competition is selling eels in a bucket. Suddenly, there's a commotion. A robed figure has discovered a footprint of St. George in a lump of clay and is charging bystanders to press their own foot into it for luck, fertility, or improved knightly valor. One woman removes her boot and plants her foot in the clay with such force that the whole sculpture collapses. She gets a round of applause. You drift over to another booth where a slick-looking man with a hood and charming teeth is selling feathers, bright gold-tipped ones. "From the wings of Archangel Michael," he says smoothly. "Only 3 pennies. Limited supply." Heaven restocks on Thursday. You raise an eyebrow. Fine, he adds, they're from a very fancy goose. But imagine the story. You're starting to see how pickpockets thrive here. A jostle, a distraction, a sudden miracle, and boom, your purse is lighter, and your soul allegedly is not. A large round man wearing a patchwork robe approaches you with a smile and a strange offer. Would you like to be pardoned for your future sins? He holds up a letter sealed in wax. Future sins, you ask. Preemptive indulgence, he explains. Very modern, time-saving. You hesitate. He leans closer. Buy one, get one for your cousin. A monk in the background groans audibly and walks away muttering about the end of days. You notice a boy pickpocketing someone near a holy thorn display and decide to intervene until you realize they're working together. The mark gets pricked by the thorn and yells. The boy helps him. The man running the thorn stall slips a few coins from his pouch and they split the take quietly. Theater. Pure, greasy theater. Even legitimate pilgrims weren't above petty scams. Many wore the traditional shell symbol not just for faith, but to gain sympathy, shelter, or free food. Some were genuine believers. Others were professional vagabonds who had memorized more saints' names than the average bishop and could cry on cue at the mention of relics being stolen. You pass a woman selling mini reliquaries made of pressed tin and scraps of lace. Souvenirs for your sins, she chirps. One features a tiny glass bead and a piece of straw. From Bethlehem, she insists. A man behind her loudly corrects, from Barry's stable, earning a smack from her with the lace bundle. In the corner, a blindfolded juggler throws pine cones into the air while balancing on a crate labeled Divine Judgment. Show 1 pence. You don't stick around long enough to see the outcome. Pilgrim paths had once been more structured routes with designated resting places, hostels, and actual relic sites. But by the later Middle Ages, many of these paths blurred into commercial traps. A person could buy their way to salvation one step at a time if they had the coin, or fake it convincingly if they didn't. A boy no older than 10 tries to sell you a piece of St. Cuthbert's toenail. You give him a look. It's from a chicken, isn't it? He winks. Chickens are holy if they've been blessed. By who? My sister sneezed on it. She's very devout. You glance at the relic-laden stall across the way, where a vendor is selling small boxes with the inscription, Dust from Golgotha. Inside, it's just regular dirt. You pick one up and sniff it. Sand and parsley. Despite the blatant fraud, many customers here seem completely earnest. People are kissing charms, whispering prayers, and tucking holy tokens into their boots for protection. There's a strange sincerity that weaves through all the nonsense, a blend of hope, superstition, and the human need to feel connected to something beyond goats and gruel. You pass a stall with a crude painting of the Virgin Mary and an assortment of miracle beans. Plant one, the seller says, and your cow may birth twins, or your husband may stop snoring. You're almost tempted to buy one. At the end of the row, you encounter an elderly woman with a crooked back and a box of rocks. Literally. Healing stones, she says. Pick one that speaks to your ailments. You pick one at random. She nods. Excellent. That one cures doubt. Also, leg pain. And toe guilt. You hand her a coin out of sheer respect for her hustle. As you step away, the wind catches the scent of wax and incense. A friar stands beneath a tattered banner offering actual blessings. No coins, no deals, no props. People trickle toward him hesitantly, unsure if he's serious. He smiles gently and speaks softly. You linger for a moment watching, just watching. Not everyone in this market is a showman. Some still carry the weight of belief in their bones. Still, as you turn away, you nearly trip over a man selling papal forgiveness certificates signed by proxy. You don't ask who the proxy is. You're pretty sure it's just him, and you're also pretty sure he's very drunk. Your purse is lighter, your soul maybe, but you've definitely collected more feathers than anyone should. The relic hustle gradually fades behind you as the crowd thins out again, but the market's soundscape never really quiets, it just changes its key. Ahead, a cluster of shrieks erupts, half laughter, half alarm, and you pick up your pace, curiosity tugging you forward. As you round a corner, you're greeted by a truly medieval sight, a bear. A literal full-grown bear standing upright and swaying in time to a badly played flute. He's wearing a little cap. The bear, not the flutist. Welcome to the entertainment district of the market. Less goods, more giggles, and a slightly higher chance of accidental maiming. Street performers were a staple of medieval life, bringing delight, distraction, and mild existential confusion to townspeople long before Netflix or TikTok existed. The bear drops back to all fours, gives a dramatic snort, and receives a slab of what looks like honeyed bread from his handler. The flute player turns to the crowd and bellows. A miracle of God's mercy and intensive training, wains are tossed into a leather hat. You've heard of dancing bears before, popular across Europe, though technically illegal in some places. Royal edicts occasionally banned such displays, deeming them dangerous or improper use of divine creatures, but legality and enforcement rarely danced together. If the bear could groove, the crowd would move. You stroll on and notice another act gathering a crowd, a jester dressed in yellow and black motley, riding a unicycle fashioned from a barrel hoop. He's tossing apples while reciting the Lord's Prayer backward. When he drops an apple, he bows deeply and claims it was intentional. A metaphor for original sin, applause. Also a cabbage. Nearby, a woman with a painted face spins around rapidly while holding 2 live chickens, one in each hand. She's screaming something about sky blessings and winged fortunes, and someone in the crowd throws her a boiled egg. She catches it in her teeth. The chickens, to their credit, seem relatively unfazed. A boy sidles up next to you and whispers, "Bet you a groat." She drops one. You look at him. He's 8. You pass. Medieval markets were more than commerce. They were a theatrical playground. Performers like jugglers, acrobats, storytellers, fire-breathers, and trained animals were common, though often not officially sanctioned. Many of them operated without licenses and relied on wit, charm, and the occasional vanishing act when the constable showed up. One particularly shady-looking performer, long coat, false beard, catches your eye. He's pretending to be a leper. His hat rests at his feet, coins already jingling inside. A girl nearby mutters, "He's got 2 other costumes under that cloak." And sure enough, after a brief coughing fit and some dramatic limping, he ducks behind a cart, strips off the leper gear, and emerges as a Moorish prince selling fortunes for a penny. You're not even surprised anymore. Historians still debate whether these performers were truly outlaws, proto-artists, or simply the necessary comic relief in a world full of famine and feudal taxes. Probably a bit of all three. Records from town councils are full of contradictory opinions, some praising performers for bringing joy and news, others blaming them for crime, sedition, or excessive merriment during Lent. You pause at a small platform where a very serious-looking man is reading from a scroll about the Battle of Agincourt using sock puppets. Each puppet has a mustache. Aw. One wears a tiny crown. He's deeply committed to the bit. You respect that. Then from behind a wagon comes a raucous clanging noise, followed by a string of startled squeaks. You turn just in time to see a troupe of mummers, masked performers known for ridiculous costumes. Slapstick humor and sometimes satirical plays leap into the square. Today's mummers are all dressed as various farm animals. One particularly lanky man dressed as a cow chases a faux duck into the crowd, mooing menacingly. The duck throws turnips. A toddler applauds wildly. Every Tuesday, a woman beside you sighs fondly. Not all entertainers were human. In one corner, a small bearded man stands on a wooden box surrounded by trained rats that scamper through hoops and over tiny seesaws. The Rat Review, he calls it. A small sign nearby notes, "Banned from York, still beloved in Lincoln." You can't help but notice how one rat dressed in a cape seems to know exactly when to bow. Further down the row, you encounter something both amazing and slightly unsettling, a dwarf in an elaborate court jester outfit juggling knives while reciting bawdy poetry. His performance is good, very good, but there's a tension in the air because you've read that not all dwarves in these markets were performers by choice. In fact, many were bought, trained, and displayed against their will. Unlicensed dwarves, that is those not officially attached to noble courts or licensed guilds, were often treated like property. You overhear a merchant whisper to his friend, "He escaped Lord Halworth's estate. I'd bet my best herring on it." You wonder if that's true. You wonder how many people here are performing because they want to, or because it's the only way to survive. It's a sobering moment in an otherwise ridiculous afternoon. You watch as the dwarf finishes his act, collects coins, bows low, and disappears behind a curtain of canvas. A few people clap. A few just look away. You turn and nearly collide with a fire breather prepping for his next performance. He gives you a toothless grin and asks, "Wanna feel holy fire?" before spitting a jet of flame into the sky. The crowd gasps. A woman faints. Someone's bonnet catches fire, but it's quickly put out with ale. Fire breathing was a popular market act, despite being banned in many places. It was dangerous, dramatic, and frequently misunderstood as sorcery. In fact, one performer in 15th century Bohemia was arrested after the local bishop swore he'd summoned the devil through his mouth. In his defense, the devil would have had a lot more teeth. You back away just in time to avoid another gout of flame and nearly stumble into a puppet show meant for children, but featuring a surprising amount of political satire. The night puppet is fighting Sir Taxalot, who has a coin purse for a head. The kids laugh. The adults nod grimly. The humor in these performances isn't just slapstick, it's clever, biting, and layered. These aren't just jokes, they're commentary. The performers are news anchors, critics, and therapists all rolled into one, coated in soot and feathers. A slow chant rises from a group of musicians on the edge of the crowd, drums, flutes, and what appears to be someone playing a lute with their feet. The music draws people like moths. You follow only to realize it's leading to a holy man who tells fortunes based on how your feet smell. He leans toward you. "You've walked through betrayal," he murmurs. Or turnips. Hard to say. You tip him anyway. Not far off, a woman balances on a tightrope stretched between two poles. Beneath her, a sign reads, "Mad Meg." 1 fall per market. She winks as she walks. You clench involuntarily every time the rope wobbles. A man below takes bets on whether she'll fall before she gets to the punchline of her monologue about marriage. You finally find a bench, well, a barrel, with a plank on top, and sit down to take in the scene. It's beautiful chaos. Laughter and singing, knives and rats, chickens and fire. The medieval marketplace may not have had Wi-Fi, but it definitely had content. Infinite, strange, morally questionable content. And you haven't even gotten to the turnip theft yet. You've barely had time to appreciate the rhythmic squawking of Mad Meg's final tightrope joke, something about husbands and chickens, when a sudden high-pitched scream cuts through the crowd. Not the theatrical kind. This one is real. You jump up from your makeshift bench just in time to witness what appears to be a full-blown produce chase. A young boy is sprinting past you with a very large turnip. It's roughly the size of a modest dog and clearly stolen, given that an apoplectic woman is hot on his heels, apron flapping like a battle flag, screaming, "Thief, that's my prize route." The boy ducks under a pie cart, rolls beneath a herring barrel, and vanishes into a tangle of drying laundry hung too low over one of the stalls. The turnip goes with him. The woman, wheezing but determined, points toward the alley. Someone stop that sprout-snatching gremlin. No one does. Welcome to the tangled, turnip-scented world of medieval market crime, petty, performative, and often completely ridiculous. Theft was rampant in medieval markets. With crowds thick, guards distracted, and traders juggling a dozen customers at once, the perfect setting was created for sticky fingers, creative lies, and occasionally full-on vegetable heists. You wander over to the turnip stall, which now features a sign that simply reads, "Smaller turnips still available." Less cursed. The merchant, still grumbling, is recounting to nearby customers how that particular turnip had been prophesied by a monk to cure winter headaches. That seems unlikely, but you respect the lore. Market theft, especially of food, was rarely prosecuted with consistent severity. Sometimes the thief was whipped, sometimes they were pilloried, and sometimes, if they were charming or young, they were simply shooed away with a clout and a loaf of bread. Historians still argue whether the inconsistent punishment of small crimes in markets reflected medieval mercy or just administrative laziness. After all, catching someone who's stolen a fish is much easier than explaining why you were in the fish stall to begin with, elbow deep in brine and judgment. You stroll past a row of booths where a more sophisticated form of theft is underway, identity theft, or more specifically, reputation theft. You stop at a booth that reads Marwick & Sons Tailors to the High Court. That seems impressive, until you notice another sign half covered by a curtain reading formerly Millie's Mittens. The stall is freshly repainted, and the Sons look suspiciously like hired actors who haven't quite gotten their British accents down. This is one of the quieter surprises of medieval markets, the constant reinvention of identity. With few birth certificates, no passports, and no social media to call your bluff, people could quite literally reinvent themselves every few towns. Today, you're a cobbler. Tomorrow, you're a clothier to bishops and barons, all thanks to a stolen family name and a new coat. One recorded case from 1372 involved a man named Gervais, who posed as the son of a minor noble to gain trust in several markets. He sold subpar velvet and vanished with a dozen unpaid debts. The real noble later commented, "If I'd had a son that clever, I wouldn't be upset." Fair enough. You overhear a merchant loudly claiming that he's a descendant of the royal furriers. His hands covered in ink stains, and very few furs tell a different story. A young woman nearby tells you in a whisper that he used to sell eels 3 weeks ago. But fur sounded posher, so now he's descended from mink. She grins. "I'm the Pope's niece, by the way. Want to buy a hat?" You politely decline. The urge to impress wasn't purely fraudulent. Many market sellers genuinely believed that borrowing a better surname or associating themselves with an established guild, even if they weren't members, would lend legitimacy to their goods. In a world without Yelp reviews, reputation traveled by word-of-mouth rumor and how loudly you could shout over your neighbor. You pass a booth offering nobleman's mustard, once served at court. The label is scrawled in charcoal on a broken plank. The mustard is violently yellow and bubbling slightly. You pretend not to notice the seller winking at a friend and muttering, "Don't tell him about the horseradish incident." Behind you, a man hawks Queen's leather belts. You recognize the leather as the same stiff, cracked stuff being sold 3 stalls over by a man who just calls it brown. Branding matters. A teenage boy runs past yelling, "Pears from the bishop's orchard." He's holding a sack that may or may not have come from a bishop's anything. 2 pears bounce out. One is immediately stolen by a dog. Even names weren't safe. Some merchants would adopt prestigious surnames, Taylor, Mercer, Draper, not because they were born to them, but because the association helped business. There's a record of 3 men named Goldsmith in a small town who all sold nails, and none of them had ever touched gold. One eventually added the prefix "not a" to his name just to avoid lawsuits. Not a goldsmith. Honest, if nothing else. You stroll past another food stall, this one selling honey cakes, when you notice the nameplate Lady Briar's Bakes. A young woman with a smudge of flour on her nose gives you a crooked smile. That's me, Lady Briar. You tilt your head. Is that your real name? She winks. Only on Wednesdays. Sounds better than Mildred Goat-Daughter, don't it? You nod, because yes, it does. The medieval market wasn't just a place to buy things, it was a stage. People performed identities here. Trial ran new personas, and sometimes lied so well they fooled themselves. It wasn't always malicious. Sometimes it was survival. If a name got you fed, it was yours. If a backstory got you a customer, it became part of who you were. Of course, not all name thefts were benign. In one scandalous episode from 1451, a merchant forged the identity of a dead guildmaster to issue fake apprenticeships and collect their fees. The deception unraveled when one of the apprentices noticed the signature on his license matched the handwriting on a tavern wall that read, "For a good time, ask Jeff." Jeff, unfortunately, was the dead master. You duck into a shadowed corner to rest for a moment and notice a chalkboard leaning against a pile of cloaks. It reads, "Today, I am Master of Salt Cheese Whisperer. Reluctant Prophet. Please tip accordingly." A copper cup beside it holds 3 buttons and a pigeon feather. Just when you think you've seen it all, the turnip thief reappears, now disguised in a new tunic and hat, walking confidently, the massive root balanced on his shoulder like a trophy. You swear he gives you a cheeky nod as he vanishes once again into the crowd. You shake your head. The market rolls on, layered with stories, names, and turnips, none of which are quite what they seem. You continue weaving through the market maze past the booths of makeshift nobility and renamed goat daughters when something bright and scandalously red catches your eye. It's sitting proudly in the middle of a table gleaming like a forbidden jewel, a tomato. Careful where you point your eyeballs, a nearby merchant hisses quickly, covering the tomato with a handkerchief. Some folks faint at the sight. You blink. It's just a tomato. He looks around nervously. That's what you think. And suddenly, you're deep in the realm of sumptuary laws and medieval food paranoia, a strange intersection of fashion, police color-coded class systems, and culinary suspicion that feels equal parts absurd and surprisingly influential. The tomato, you learn, is not well understood in this part of the world. It's a New World fruit, rare, exotic, and widely believed by some to be poisonous. Others think it's an aphrodisiac. Some say it was grown with sorcery, and a few whisper that a nobleman once swooned just from seeing one, not from eating it, just from looking, and not in a romantic way. Like full-on swoon and soil the tunic kind of collapse. You glance at the hidden fruit now swaddled in linen like it's on trial. So why are you selling it? Because there's always someone curious, the vendor says with a shrug. Plus, the apothecaries buy them to use in potions. Love potions mostly. Or potions to cancel love. That tracks. You move along, still pondering the social dangers of salad, and find yourself passing a stall covered entirely in dull regulation-colored fabrics. Browns, grays, mud-stained greens. All very earthy. All very sad. Peasant cloth, the seller mutters. No blues, no reds, not unless you're willing to risk a fine or a flogging. You realize that what you're seeing is not just a color palette, it's a form of legal compliance. You've entered the domain of sumptuary laws, the oddly specific medieval regulations that dictated who could wear what, eat what, and even use certain materials based entirely on their social class. Want to wear velvet? Better be a noble. Fancy eating a swan? Only if you own land. Dreaming of a tunic? dyed with Tyrian purple. Enjoy your jail time, peasant. Historians still argue whether sumptuary laws were genuinely effective at maintaining class distinctions, or just gave officials something else to write about in between famine reports. But one thing's clear, they weren't just fashion guidelines. They were enforced social boundaries stitched into everyday life. You watch as a woman in a surprisingly vivid shade of blue hurriedly wraps herself in a more neutral cloak as she nears a town guard. Her expression is that of someone hiding contraband, or maybe a particularly scandalous belt. Even fabric dyes could get you in trouble. Saffron, yellow reserved. Indigo, heavily taxed. Gold thread. Absolute nope, unless you had a direct line to a crown. And yet plenty of people flaunted the rules secretly, creatively, or brazenly, depending on how confident they were that the local inspector had poor eyesight or owed them money. A merchant near you is whispering to a customer, "This silk's almost red. Call it burnt copper," if anyone asks. He winks. The buyer nods like he's just purchased an illegal manuscript rather than 3 feet of fabric. But clothing was only half the drama. Sumptuary laws extended to food, too. In many towns, laws stated what types of meat could be served on certain days, who could eat pastries, yes, pastries, and how many courses could be consumed in one sitting based on your rank. A knight might get 3. A merchant 2. A peasant, whatever you can steal from the turnip thief if you're fast enough. You overhear a baker complaining that she was fined for adding sugar to her tarts because sweetening the poor is against the order of things. You're not even sure what that means, but it sounds depressing. Not all enforcement was harsh, though. Some places relied on community shame rather than official punishment. One woman tells you that her aunt wore a brocade ribbon to a wedding and was sneezed at repeatedly by the town elders until she took it off. Harsh. A sign over a food stall reads, "Approved pottage only." No heretical garnishes. You don't ask. Still rebellion bubbled beneath the surface. People found ways to sneak saffron into stews, tuck silk linings into their otherwise coarse cloaks, and trade in smuggled spices like they were contraband opiates. And speaking of spices, just across the road, a commotion erupts around a boy selling suspiciously red sausages. A guard stomps over, demands to know the source of the flame tint, and the boy shrugs. "Beet juice," he says innocently. The guard squints, chews a bit, and declares, "Tastes like treason." The sausages are confiscated. The boy vanishes with the coin pouch. You duck into the nearest stall to avoid being mistaken for an accessory to culinary rebellion, and discover you've stumbled into a makeshift tailor's shop. There are needles, buttons, scraps of lace, and a heavily bearded man hunched over a sleeve. He's embroidering tiny flowers. Making a wedding tunic, he grunts. Groom says he wants noble flair. He snorts. He's a shoemaker. Won't that get him fined? Not if he wears it under a potato sack. Smart. There's something both ridiculous and deeply human about it all. People wanted to dress beautifully. They wanted to eat delicious things. And for centuries, the people in charge tried very hard to tell them not to remind them every waking moment of their place in the pecking order. But humans, being the stubborn, sneaky creatures they are, found loopholes. A group of teenagers walk by, giggling, dressed in layers of mismatched cloth, each hiding a small piece of band fabric in their pockets. One of them opens his tunic just enough to flash a strip of silk and whispers, "Nobility of the armpit." You laugh, and he grins before disappearing into the crowd like a very poorly camouflaged rainbow. You wander back toward the tomato vendor, who has now drawn a small, fascinated crowd. He's explaining the tomato's magical properties. It wards off bad luck, boredom, and boring in-laws, he says, with the confidence of a man who definitely made that up 5 minutes ago. Someone offers him a whole shilling for it. He hesitates, then accepts. The tomato is wrapped delicately and taken away in a box. Will he eat it, you ask? Not a chance, the vendor says. But he'll talk about it for weeks. You're about to leave when someone shouts, "Tomato heresy," in mock alarm. Everyone laughs except a very confused elderly woman who starts making the sign of the cross. In this corner of the market, color, flavor, and fabric are more than aesthetics. They're identity, defiance, hope, and occasionally the reason someone ends up in a very uncomfortable town meeting explaining why their tunic had sequins. And somewhere, probably a nobleman is still recovering from his terrifying glimpse of salad. You turn a corner, still chuckling about the tomato panic and the armpit nobility rebellion, when your boot meets something soft, cold, and unexpectedly amphibious. You look down. It's a frog. A very unimpressed frog who blinks once, croaks with disdain, and hops directly into a nearby jar. The jar, by the way, is not empty. With a sploosh, the frog disappears beneath a viscous, bubbling substance that smells like sulfur and wet firewood. Then the jar begins to hiss. You backpedal, bump into a startled merchant, and both of you watch as the jar rattles ominously for a moment before falling silent. The label reads in shaky handwriting, "Fire jar." Contents volatile. Not soup. Welcome to the riskier end of the market, the place where useful meets dangerous, and dangerous pretends to be useful. Here among the apothecaries and would-be alchemists, you'll find the closest thing to medieval science: jars of explosive powder, unregulated chemical concoctions, and at least 3 different items labeled cure-all that could probably peel paint off a wall. A young man walks by with a tray of safety herbs that smell like burnt cabbage. He offers you a sniff. You politely decline and move along, careful to avoid another jar labeled experimental grease. Not far from the frog jar incident, a man is selling fire powder, an early form of gunpowder used more for terrifying neighbors than actually starting battles. He demonstrates by tossing a pinch into a small metal bowl and lighting it. With a whoosh, a fireball launches upward, singes a hanging banner, and sets off a chain reaction of chickens shrieking from a nearby poultry stall. The man laughs. Perfect for weddings. Gunpowder had started making its way into medieval Europe by the 13th century, though its use was largely limited to military purposes at first. However, small-scale traders and tinkerers experimented with it, sometimes dangerously. Town records from Cologne include a complaint from a woman whose husband attempted to build a fire-summoning contraption and accidentally blew a hole in their chicken coop. The chickens apparently never came back. Historians still argue whether gunpowder's early civilian use was a matter of curiosity or economic desperation. Either way, some merchants saw it as a hot commodity, literally. As you edge away from the fire jars, another vendor calls out from a stall decorated with soot and anxiety. Charms against arson, guaranteed or mildly flammable. She's selling bundles of herbs, small clay tokens, and what she calls blessed ash. You examine one and realize it's just a lump of burnt bread. Symbolic protection, she assures you. Nearby, a man with singed eyebrows holds up a wooden box. "Weather traps," he cries. "Catch bad storms before they hit your roof." "How does it work?" someone asks. He shrugs. "The storm knows. Don't open it indoors." The combination of amateur chemistry and medieval superstition here is overwhelming. You're surrounded by potions, powders, and tools nobody seems to fully understand, but everybody insists will solve something. And where there's mystery and magic, you find petty vengeance. You pass a booth where a red-faced woman is quietly paying a man to deliver a jar of itching powder to her neighbor's bakery. "She stole my custard recipe," the woman growls. "Let her scratch through Lent." Market stalls weren't just for commerce, they were for feuds. If someone undercut your price, spread gossip about your flour quality, or dared to flirt with your favorite fishmonger, revenge could and often did follow. Sometimes it was subtle, salted garden beds, swapped signs, misdirected customers. Sometimes it was loud, like the cabbage incident of 1399, when a disgruntled vendor launched a cart of spoiled greens at a rival's stall mid-sermon. The sermon notably continued uninterrupted. You're beginning to understand why medieval markets had guilds not just for organizing trades, but for refereeing their disputes. Two tanners across from you are now engaged in a low-grade shouting match about who sold inferior leather to the shoemaker guild. One gestures angrily with a stained cowhide. The other retaliates by loudly reciting an unflattering poem that ends with, "And he smells like a monk's confession." Guilds were powerful organizations, unions, trade regulators, social clubs, and legal battalions rolled into one. If you sold bread, brewed ale, made candles, or stitched gloves, there was a guild for you. And heaven help you if you weren't part of it. Operating outside a guild could mean hefty fines, public shaming, or outright banning from the market. That said, joining wasn't cheap. Apprenticeships took years. Membership required fees, gifts, and sometimes elaborate initiations involving fish guts and questionable songs. One vendor you pass wears a brooch shaped like a loaf of bread. "Guild of Bakers," she explains proudly. "We wear the pin. It keeps the rats respectful." A man beside her scoffs. "Rats can't read pins. They can smell bureaucracy," she replies. Even with guilds watching over their own market, crimes persisted. Not the flashy kind, no grand jewel thefts or horse heists. No market crimes were delightfully mundane. Selling watered-down ale, hiding rocks inside sacks of grain, or claiming spoiled onions were blessed and therefore immune to rot. You pass a man selling invisible ink. "It's just water." "Write your secrets," he declares. "Only you will see them, technically true." Another stall offers anti-theft charms for coin pouches. A woman buys one, pins it inside her cloak, and immediately realizes her actual pouch is gone. She stares at the charm. It's symbolic, the seller offers. You catch a pair of children running between stalls, casually tugging on loose purse strings, testing knots. They don't take anything today, but they're practicing, preparing, learning the trade. It's like pickpocket internship. Meanwhile, a group of vendors argue over a recently installed stall awning. One says it casts too much shadow. Another claims it's funneling bad wind into her stew. The debate escalates to the point where someone produces a dead frog and declares it evidence of sorcery. You decide not to intervene. As the sun arcs higher, the scent of something scorched wafts through the market. A small fire has broken out, probably from the fire jar incident, and a group of vendors rush to put it out using damp cloaks, buckets of milk, and sheer panic. One man throws a sack of flour onto the flames. This does not help. Eventually, the blaze is doused, the culprits shouted at, and life resumes. A boy walks past selling slightly burnt buns. "Smoky flavor," he chirps. You step aside to let a one-eyed man wheel a cart labeled "Useful Things That Might Be Cursed" through the alley. On it, 3 broken lanterns, a cracked mirror, a rusty bell, and a doll missing half a face. You don't ask questions. The further you go, the more you see how this market is less an organized shopping district and more a barely restrained eruption of need, superstition, and everyday hustle. Explosions, rare but accepted. Theft, expected. Frogs in jars, not great, but not a deal-breaker. You pass a man muttering to a cabbage. No one bats an eye. The scent of scorched cabbage slowly fades behind you, replaced by something subtler. Yeast, damp wood, and the tang of spilt beer. You follow the trail, and soon find yourself in a cluster of stalls, boasting tankards, barrels, and signs with slogans like "Ale fit for the bishop's beard" and "Drink, now forget, harvest debts later." It's time to meet the alewives and the terrifyingly specific group of people tasked with inspecting their work, the bread police. But let's begin with bread. You approach a stall neatly stacked with round, flat loaves, each one stamped with a symbol. The baker, a thin woman with arms dusted in flour and a face that radiates exhausted pride, gestures to the loaves. Stamped and weighed this morning. No fraud, no mold, no funny business. You nod, taking in the small wooden scale next to her. Behind it, a crude chart painted on cloth compares the proper weight of a farthing loaf against various other items. One says, should weigh more than a turnip, less than a duck egg. That's helpful if you're well versed in medieval poultry. Baking, it turns out, was a regulated art. Bread was the backbone of every meal, from peasant stew to noble feasts, and it had to meet strict guidelines, especially in towns with charters. The assize of bread and ale. A centuries-old law that sounds like a forgotten Tolkien novella dictated the exact price, weight, and quality of loaves and drinks based on current grain costs. And enforcing it. That fell to the bread inspectors, a crew of very serious individuals, often referred to informally as the bread police. You hear them before you see them. Boots on cobbles, the faint clink of scales, and the unmistakable sound of an official complaint being recited. This loaf was light by half a plum weight and baked with unblessed salt. A portly man in a brown cloak holds up a crusty roll like it's contraband. Care to explain this crumb texture? The baker beside him. A boy of maybe 16 stammers it was windy. Wind is not a grain substitute, the inspector replies, jotting something onto a parchment scroll with an absurdly long feather quill. Bread policing was no joke. Bakers who tried to cheat customers could be fined, pilloried, or forced to give away their entire stock for free. One historical account details a baker made to carry his underweight loaves through the town on a stick with a sign that read, "Here walks breadless honor." Yikes. Still, not everyone feared the inspectors. One woman nearby boasts that her loaves have never been questioned. She claims it's due to her spirit yeast, a mysterious ingredient passed down from her grandmother. You ask what's in it. She leans close and whispers, "Cheap dreams." You back away slowly. But bread is only half the tale. Just past the flower zone, things grow louder and more fragrant. You've stumbled into ale country, a section of the market that's part pub, part cauldron, and part social experiment gone slightly sideways. Here, women called ale wives stand behind large barrels of frothy liquid, scooping tankards full and yelling to passers-by. One waves a spoon in your direction. One sip and you'll forget your debts, your age, and your last 3 sins. You take a cautious sip. It's gritty, but oddly refreshing, also possibly a little sour. Summer batch, she explains, brewed with nettles, patience, and a little rain from St. John's Day. You don't ask what St. John's rain means. Alewives were powerful figures in their communities. Brewing was one of the few trades women could dominate legally, and they did with flair competition and the occasional sharp elbow to a rival's ribs. Some brewed in their kitchens and sold from their windows. Others, like the women here, set up full stalls complete with benches, baked goods, and in one case, a small goose that honks disapprovingly at anyone who doesn't tip. That goose is wearing a tiny hat. You can't look away. But being an alewife wasn't just about hops and cheer, it came with scrutiny. Just like bread, ale was subject to official measurement. If your brew was too weak, too expensive, or too funky, you could be fined or shut down. One method of detection involved ale tasters, who were chosen by the town to sample random batches and report on quality. Imagine your nosy neighbor being paid to day drink for justice. That's basically what happened. You overhear one alewife muttering about last week's taster. Took 7 cups to declare it drinkable. Man's a menace. He left wearing one of my aprons. Ale tampering was common. Some added herbs for strength, others added less noble things. A complaint from 1421 records a woman fined for watering down her ale with river runoff and then claiming it was holy water. She now lives 3 towns away under the name Sister Bruella. As you take another sip, a scuffle breaks out. 2 alewives are yelling over whose bench stole customers from the other's shadow. One waves a ladle like a sword. The goose honks in support. A boy leaps between them with surprising agility and deposits a full tankard on your bench. "Try this one," he whispers. "Better head, fewer curses." You take a sip. It's delicious. In the midst of this bubbling chaos, a man in clerical robes arrives. "Ale inspection," he declares. "Of course it is," mutters one of the women. "Here comes Brother Foam." The friar proceeds to sample every ale on the row. He makes a great show of it, swirling the drink, sniffing it, muttering notes. Notes of turnip. Hints of despair. Ooh, this one's hopeful. Turns out, he's not an official inspector, just a local who figured out how to get free drinks. The vendors tolerate him because he's harmless, mildly entertaining, and sometimes, just sometimes, his poetic critiques attract new customers. You move down to a smaller stall at the edge of the row, where an older woman sells only one brew. A chalkboard beside her says, "Isle of Truth, only drink if you dare." What happens, you ask? She smiles mysteriously. Depends what you've been lying about. You pass on the offer and instead grab a sweet roll from her side tray. It's sticky, spiced, and surprisingly soft. She winks. Baked it with confession and cinnamon. Across from her, another woman is advertising a new batch by promising it's boil-free. You're not sure if that's supposed to be reassuring, but her crowd is large. Maybe marketing is everything. You linger for a while, soaking in the sounds of tankards, clinking songs half-sung, and laughter that rolls through the market like spring thunder. Even the goose seems content now, napping beneath a stool, with its hat slightly askew. In a place where so much of life is ruled by mud, war and taxes, bread and ale represent something more than sustenance. There's stability, familiarity, a chance to argue, celebrate, or forget for just a moment that the world is usually on fire, either metaphorically or, as you saw earlier, literally. And if a goose in a hat wants to guard that happiness, let it. You leave behind the alewives and their squabbling geese, head buzzing slightly, heart warmed by yeast and laughter, and find yourself entering a very different section of the market. The shouting fades. The ground here is swept. The stalls are neater, fancier. Even the vendors seem quieter, more refined, as if whispering their wares is part of the performance. Welcome to the luxury quarter, where the smells are no longer goatfish or fear, but clove cinnamon and something uncomfortably similar to wealth. You pause near a table lined with tiny glass vials of oil, each sealed with wax and labeled in elaborate handwriting. The merchant, a thin man in a pointed hat that screams alchemist who's pretending to be a perfumer, leans in with a practiced smile. Essences, he says, for lovers, dreamers, and particularly ambitious social climbers. You pick up a vial and sniff. Your nostrils are immediately filled with the heady scent of rose pine and possibly regret. What's this one called? He squints. Elixir of knowing too much. He nods solemnly. Very popular with scribes. As strange as it sounds, perfume was a serious business in medieval markets, especially among merchants from Italy, Spain, and the Middle East. Scents were believed not just to mask odor, which, let's be honest, was everywhere, but to affect health, emotions, and status. Musk, myrrh, ambergris, it wasn't just cologne. It was chemistry class signal and low-key witchcraft, all bottled into one. Further along, you reach a canopy-draped stall full of powders, bottles, and what appeared to be carefully preserved beetles. For makeup, the woman explains, waving toward a carved mirror. Crushed carmine snail gel, saffron tint, and peacock ash. Guaranteed to make your cheeks brighter and your enemies envious. You stare at a tiny jar labeled Eternal Bloom. It costs more than most people earn in a week. Cosmetics weren't just vanity, they were risk. Many used lead, arsenic, and mercury, all in the name of beauty. Historians still argue whether women knew how dangerous these concoctions were or simply didn't care. When your lifespan is short and the plague is frequent, a little arsenic blush might seem like a worthwhile gamble. Next to the makeup stall, a vendor sells dyed fabrics so vivid they seem to glow. Rolls of scarlet indigo and violet silk are stacked like treasure, while a sign reads, "Color speaks louder than words." You run your hand over a bolt of cloth. It's smooth, cool, and wildly out of your financial bracket. The merchant sees your interest and leans in. You don't have to be a noble to look like one. And how much would it cost to look like I own a castle? He smiles. Depends how many windows you want it to have. You nod appreciatively and move on. Luxury items, perfumes, silk, spices weren't just status symbols. They were currency in their own right. A single vial of imported clove oil could buy a sheep. A pound of saffron might settle a merchant's debt. And that's assuming the saffron is real. You're passing another spice vendor when you hear the low, angry whisper, "That's not saffron. That's marigold dust." You freeze. Two merchants are locked in a slow, passive-aggressive duel across identical wooden tables. One is an older man with a beard so thick it could house a second personality. The other is a younger woman in an aggressively yellow dress. "Saffron is golden and holy," the woman says sweetly, holding up a delicate jar. The man snorts. "It's fake. The only holy thing here is your imagination." Saffron, the tiny red stigma from a certain crocus flower, was one of the most valuable commodities in the medieval world. More expensive by weight than gold, it was used in cooking dyes and medicine, and therefore ripe for fraud. Enter the saffron smugglers. Whispers of saffron theft and forgery were common across Europe. Merchants would cut real saffron with dried marigold petals, turmeric, or even threads soaked in dye. Some smugglers hid the real deal in hollowed books beneath false cart bottoms or braided into wigs. You hear one man quietly boasting that he once passed saffron through customs by hiding it inside a cooked goose. Historians still debate how much saffron fraud actually made it to market, but there's no doubt that authorities took it seriously. In 1444, a saffron war broke out in Basel after one batch was stolen from a warehouse. Swords were drawn. People were jailed. All over a spice that, yes, still stains everything. It touches bright orange. You move along to a stall selling recipe scrolls, actual written instructions for lavish dishes encrypted in strange shorthand. The vendor tells you they're kitchen codes passed between noble households and only recently copied by a scribe who may or may not have been excommunicated. You raise a brow. He shrugs. He had really neat handwriting. You pick up one scroll that includes directions for swan pie and something called meat milk. You put it back gently, like it might bite. Recipe theft was another unexpected market crime. Noble kitchens guarded their dish secrets as closely as their family lineages. Servants who left a lord's house with a recipe could be accused of betrayal. One merchant proudly tells you his sauce recipe was smuggled from an abbot's feast in the folds of a napkin. Risked damnation for that one, he says proudly. As strange as it sounds, food culture was a form of warfare among the rich. To serve something no one else could replicate was to show power. And so recipes were bought, stolen, encoded, and sometimes sold to the highest bidder, right here next to sacks of saffron and highly suspicious nutmeg. Next, you reach the perfumed parchment booth. That's right, scrolls that smell. The woman selling them smiles faintly. For love letters, or letters of exile. Whichever fits your week. You pick up a sample that smells of violets and singed mint. Popular with scribes, she adds, covers up the ink sweat. As you tuck the parchment back in place, a bell rings somewhere near the fabric stalls. A hush falls over this corner of the market. A young boy darts past, breathless. "Saffron thief," he yells. They caught one. You join the stream of curious onlookers as a merchant hauls a man by the collar to the center aisle. The accused is young, red-faced, and wearing suspiciously yellow sleeves. From his bag spill several bundles of suspiciously golden dust wrapped in cheesecloth. The crowd murmurs. The vendor holding him yells, "This man tried to sell dyed breadcrumbs as saffron." There's a collective gasp, some theatrical, some entirely genuine. The market is nothing if not dramatic. A nearby apothecary leans over to you. They'll probably make him eat it. "What, the fake saffron?" He grins. "Oh no, the real stuff. Mouthfuls of it." He won't stop sneezing for a week. Sure enough, moments later, someone begins shouting something about justice through seasoning, and you decide it's time to move on. You find a quiet spot between a velvet merchant and a man selling pillows stuffed with swan down. You sit for a moment, taking in the silk spices and scandal of the market's fanciest corner. This world of subtle thefts, whispered recipes, and perfumed promises feels galaxies away from the fish guts and turnip heists of earlier. But it's still the same market, just with better lighting and fewer geese. Luxury, after all, is just another kind of performance. And here, even the cinnamon comes with a plot twist. The scent of saffron and swan feathers still lingers in your nostrils as you drift further from the luxury stalls. But you don't get far before the weather decides to assert itself again. A low rumble rolls across the sky like someone dragging a church bench across cobblestones, and then just as you're admiring a delicate display of embroidered gloves, rain. Not the polite drizzle you might expect. This is the kind of rain that makes people immediately regret all their life choices, especially the ones involving open-air commerce and suede shoes. Shouts erupt, tarps are thrown. Merchants scramble to yank linens over fragile goods. The embroidery stand becomes a fortress of damp canvas within seconds. You take shelter under the rickety roof of a nearby fruit stall, dripping and watching the chaos unfold. Two barrels float past you like they've lost their will to be sold. A wheel of cheese tumbles into a puddle, only to be rescued by a child who shouts, "10% off now," and runs. Rain, of course, was the eternal enemy of the medieval market. Many of these towns didn't have designated covered areas for vendors. Some had permanent stalls with makeshift roofs. Others relied on awnings, prayer, and the occasional miracle. And when the rain came, everything textiles, books, powders, salt, dignity was at risk. Near the main aisle, you spot one unlucky merchant whose entire cart has sunk into a newly formed pit of slush. He's standing ankle-deep in what used to be dry land, glaring at his tilted wheel like it betrayed him personally. A man approaches, squinting through the downpour, holding a small scroll and a dripping quill. "Mud clerk," he says simply. Name, damage stall position, and whether you cried. You blink. Mud clerk. "Oh yes," he says, brushing raindrops off the parchment. "Town keeps records for drainage improvements and lawsuits, and occasionally poetic purposes." Sure enough, under the heading Notable Sinkings, you glimpse names and vivid descriptions, like Agnes the candlemaker lost 3 tallow pots and her temper, and Wilhelm, the cheese whisperer wheel submerged, declared vengeance on the sky. Apparently, chronicling weather misfortune is an official job here. Rain meant trouble, financial, emotional, sometimes spiritual. One merchant across the path is muttering darkly into a bowl of soggy lentils, insisting the storm is punishment for last week's dishonest honey pricing. You suspect the lentils agree. Historians still argue whether early town councils made any sincere effort to improve market drainage, or just hired more scribes to write increasingly poetic weather complaints. One surviving record from Bruges includes the phrase, "Rain fell like unpaid taxes, soaking the hopes of all but the duck vendors." And speaking of curses, it's not long before someone mutters those magic words. Witch weather. You hear it from a fabric vendor whose best velvet just got soaked. She stares skyward, finger-pointed, and announces, "This storm wasn't natural. I told you someone cursed the new dye batch. It's the color of envy, and envy brings floods." You blink. Others nod. A man beside her pulls a hood over his head. Knew it. Told my wife. Should have bought brown. The idea that weather could be cursed wasn't unusual in medieval Europe. Many believed that storms could be summoned or directed by witches, angry saints, or even improperly buried relics. Entire fields of crops were blamed on neighborly grudges. One man in a village chronicle insisted his goat gave sour milk every time his sister-in-law looked at it during rain. You inch toward a stand where a merchant sells nothing but beeswax charms. For weather, she explains solemnly, hang them over your stall, or eat them if things get really bad. You raise an eyebrow. They're vanilla, she adds. It's hard to tell if she's joking. Rain continues to lash the market. A pair of boys are using a broken crate as a boat, paddling it with wooden spoons down the mud river that now snakes through the fabric aisle. An older woman yells after them, "If you drown in that, I'm not fishing you out twice." Over by the vegetable stalls, a new kind of drama unfolds. A seller is frantically trying to convince customers that her turnips are now blessed by the storm gods and will cure soggy feet. She even makes up a chant on the spot. It's catchy. People start singing along. A handful of vendors huddle together, sheltering under a leaning meat cart that's beginning to smell questionable. Last time it rained like this, one says, the fishwife's eel barrel got struck by lightning. Cooked half the eels, sold the rest for double. Miracles, another nods. You watch a man attempt to scoop rainwater from his display using a ladle. Every time he turns around, it fills again. He finally throws the ladle into a puddle and yells, "Fine." The rain wins. Not all stalls fare equally. The spice sellers, usually so refined, are now surrounded by a perfumed swamp of cinnamon-colored runoff. Their saffron has turned to saffron soup. A vendor stares into it with the heartbreak of a man watching gold dissolve. A small procession appears, clergy in soggy robes muttering prayers and waving incense. Saint Medard, protector of the weather, beset the friar chants, "Spare our bread and booths." He steps in a puddle so deep he nearly baptizes himself. Meanwhile, a man in a very pointy hat is doing what appears to be a rain dance, but in reverse. He hops in a circle while muttering a spell that mostly sounds like, "Go away, go away, go away." People gather to cheer him on, partly because they're desperate, and partly because there's not much else to do when you're soaked, and your barley cakes are now barley paste. At the edges of the market, drainage trenches overflow. Ducks appear, actual ducks, marching in formation like they've been summoned. A child runs after them, yelling, "Our new leaders have arrived." Through it all, the mud clerk continues his solemn work. He's now interviewing a wet merchant about her lost cartwheel. "Was it sentimental?" he asks. "A bit," she sighs. He writes that down. Eventually, the rain slackens. Slowly, incredibly, a patch of sunlight slices through the gray. People emerge from under carts and cloaks. There's a hesitant cheer, then a louder one, and then a round of applause directed, for some reason, at the goat tied near the bread stall. The goat bows. Or maybe it just sneezes. You shake the water from your cloak and resume walking, squelching your way through the recovering stalls. Some merchants start spreading cloth to dry. Others hang damp herbs and salted fish from makeshift lines, declaring them storm-aged for extra flavor. A few vendors like the Spiceman simply sit quietly, staring into the distance, as though re-evaluating every life decision that led to this moment. You give him a sympathetic nod. Rain might have dampened the market, but it hasn't dampened its spirit. The chaos of mud superstition and soggy turnips only adds to its charm. After all, what's a medieval marketplace without a little biblical level weather and one officially employed mud historian? And with that, you step carefully around a collapsed pie cart and into the next alley, where naturally a goat is standing on top of a table wearing a crown made of leeks. Because of course it is. You're still drying off your boots, audibly squelching with each step, when a fresh wave of shouting rolls over you like a particularly loud prayer bell. You round a corner just in time to see two merchants standing toe-to-toe, red-faced and gesturing wildly. One is holding a cabbage, the other a quill. "I'll see you in the town court, you turnip-hearted fraud," bellows the quill holder. The cabbage wielder responds with a voice like gravel soaked in ale. "You call my linen dish-rag grade again, and I'll embroider your backside with a broom." Welcome to the glorious world of medieval insult combat, a competitive and sometimes legally actionable blood sport in the heart of the marketplace. Around you, the crowd begins to form its usual horseshoe, eager to see how this verbal joust unfolds. There will be yelling, there may be flying produce, and if you're lucky, someone will faint. As if on cue, a goat standing nearby bleats, once keels over, and collapses into a heap. You blink. Someone in the crowd says, "Oh, that's Mildred's fainting goat," gets overwhelmed by drama. We all do, really. The crowd adjusts, leaving space around the goat like it's a revered member of the local judiciary. Insults in the medieval market weren't just petty, they were dangerous. Words could carry as much weight as weapons, especially in a world where honor, reputation, and business all depended on being respected, or at least feared. A well-placed accusation could destroy a competitor. A poorly timed insult that could land you in front of a magistrate, or worse, in a week-long public shaming. One of the current combatants, let's call him Cabbage Man, has now advanced to rhyming abuse. Your buttons are brittle, and your beard's full of lice. Your apron's a relic, your moral's a vice. The crowd oohs appreciatively. The quill merchant counters, "At least I sell truth, not smelly false cloth. You wouldn't know silk from the back end of a sloth." A nearby monk winces. "That doesn't even make sense," he mutters. Historians still argue whether market-based defamation trials were more about genuine justice or just public spectacle. But either way, many towns maintained strict laws on slander, especially if it damaged a person's business or guild standing. In fact, written records of lawsuits over insults survive to this day. One involved a butcher accusing another of selling dog meat labeled Bishop's Stew. Another featured two fishwives battling over who first coined the phrase, "She stinks like low tide in Lent." Some insults were even codified. There were rules about what you could legally call someone without requiring compensation. Thief, whore, liar, all dangerous words. And if you hurled one publicly without proof, you might owe the person a fine, a public apology, or a week of community service picking straw from pig pens. You once again hear the unmistakable scratching of quill on parchment. It's the mud clerk. He's reappeared now, doubling as the insult scribe. Documenting proceedings for potential trial, he explains. Also, collecting the best lines for the winter play. You admire the efficiency. Meanwhile, the goat has begun to stir. The crowd applauds softly. Someone offers it a bit of oat cake. The quill merchant escalates. "I'd rather boil my boots than wear your linen tunics." You couldn't hem a straight line if St. Peter himself lent you his spine. Cabbage Man raises the cabbage in what appears to be a threatening motion, but then suddenly drops it. "I challenge thee to a testimonial roast," he shouts. The crowd gasps. A testimonial roast is a rare and highly dangerous event, an impromptu performance in which both parties must insult each other through the voices of their own imaginary customers. I once bought cloth from this man. Cabbage Man begins adopting a falsetto. It shrank faster than my husband's courage. On wedding night, please, I bought his cabbage. Quill Merchant replies in a deep, fake voice, and it tasted like my neighbor's boots, without the flavor. The goat faints again. A small child claps and yells. 10 to the Cabbage Man. You inch away from the escalating chaos and wander toward a less vocal corner of the market where the older vendors tend to mind their own business. One woman is knitting, quietly selling socks made of wool, so thick they could probably stop a crossbow bolt. Do you get many slanderers here, you ask? She shrugs. Only when someone tries to claim they invented socks. A potter nearby chimes in. I once had to stand before the guild for calling a rival's jug an insult to soup. He shakes his head. Worth it. As strange as it may sound, marketplace insults became a form of unofficial entertainment and unofficial justice. For those without lawyers or noble protection, a well-timed zinger might be their only defense against theft, fraud, or defamation. Of course, it wasn't always verbal. Insults could take the form of symbolic gestures, placing a chicken feather on a rival's cart, which implied cowardice, stacking turnips to spell crude symbols, even using colors or clothing to mock someone. Wearing yellow and green together was once considered a sly jab, suggesting your rival was both foolish and greedy. You wander past a stall where someone has hung a string of fish in a pattern that vaguely resembles a rude gesture. You ask the seller if it means something. He grins. Only to 2 people, and neither of them are speaking to me now. Nearby, a scribe has set up a booth labeled Insults Crafted to Order, Poetic or Petty. You approach, and he nods in greeting. What'll it be? Mild burn, full slander. Something to ruin your brother-in-law's weekend. You ask for an example. He taps his quill thoughtfully. How about, thou art as useful as a wet candle in a windstorm, and twice as smoky. You clap. He bows. A little further on, you discover the Guild of Mediators, a group of robed officials whose only job is to diffuse arguments before they erupt into full cabbage warfare. One of them, an elderly woman with a voice like warm stew, tells you she once stopped a knife fight over a bad cheese review. They said it tasted like regret, she recalls. Turns out, the cheese was regrettable, but you still can't say that in public. The goat, now fully recovered, strolls past, with a garland of daisies around its neck and a crowd of children in tow. You're not sure if it's a mascot or a metaphor, but either way, it's clearly thriving. You return to the site of the original verbal duel. The Cabbage Man and the Quill Merchant are now seated together, drinking from shared tankards, trading critiques of each other's shoes. Not bad, says one. Better than your rhymes. Only barely replies the other. There's something oddly heartwarming about it. In a world of disease, famine, taxes, and frequent goat fainting, the market insult is a safe performative outlet. A ritual. A contest of wit where the stakes are high, but the bruises usually aren't physical. And if the goat survives, that's a win for everyone. You've barely taken 3 steps away from the insult battleground, where the cabbage has been repurposed into soup, and the goat is now posing with children for something called a memory sketch, when you find yourself in yet another pungent part of the market. Only this time, it's not bread, or beer, or old turnips. It's bloodletting and beauty. You're in the medical lane now, where merchants in suspiciously clean robes stand beside buckets of squirming leeches, jars of pale creams, and tools that look like they've recently been involved in interrogations or artisanal cheese making. A painted sign above one stall reads, Healthy Humor's Happy Heart, Dr. Livon's Blood Lettery and Goat Consultation. Underneath it, a smaller note adds, Goat not required for all visits. Your eyes are immediately drawn to the leech seller. He's standing behind a wooden table covered in bowls, towels, and several glass jars filled with the squishy black creatures, all of them wriggling as if they know they're about to be applied to someone's uncle. Best in the region, he boasts, holding one up by the tail. Fresh, hungry, and fully trained to find the imbalance in your humors. This one specializes in melancholy. You raise an eyebrow. How does a leech specialize? He grins. She reads auras, also loves sad songs. As absurd as it sounds, leeching was one of the most popular medical treatments in the Middle Ages. Based on the ancient belief in the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, physicians and healers thought that an imbalance in any of them could lead to illness. And what better way to restore balance than to remove the excess humor with a polite, blood-hungry worm? The man gestures to a chart that shows various body parts labeled excellent bleeding zones. You immediately decide not to look too closely. Historians still argue whether leeching ever actually worked, or if it was just a placebo wrapped in superstition and squelching. Either way, medieval people lined up for it, especially on market days when healers and barbers set up pop-up surgeries next to the spice stalls and pies. Speaking of barbers, you take 3 steps to your left and immediately find yourself at a booth operated by a man who looks like he's halfway between a fashion stylist and a torturer. He's sharpening a blade with a grin. Barber surgeon, he says. Shaves, cuts, boils, lanced teeth removed, and if time allows, minor exorcisms. His menu includes hair trim and ear scrape, 2 pennies, tooth pulling with prayer. 1 penny, head boil, reduction includes leech. 3 pennies, skull drill for demons or storms negotiable. Next to him is a battered stool and a suspiciously red-streaked basin. Someone is currently seated there, gripping the arms of the chair, while the barber surgeon prepares to liberate an evil wind from behind the man's left ear. Sometimes it's just earwax, he explains cheerfully. But better safe than demon-infested. You nod carefully, not making eye contact, and step sideways into the next stall, only to find yourself face to face with a beautiful glass jar filled with slime. Snail cream, the vendor announces brightly. Freshly harvested, anti-wrinkle, good for boils. Also tastes like sadness if misused. You hesitate. She opens the jar and gestures for you to touch. You dip a finger in and discover the texture is somewhere between lotion and cooked spinach. It smells faintly of thyme. And betrayal. Used by noblewomen pilgrims and one archbishop's mistress, she says proudly. Snails are sacred, or at least slow enough to catch. Strange as it sounds, snail-based cosmetics were real. Medieval beauty treatments could include everything from ground pearls to roasted mouse ashes, but snail mucin, full of proteins and naturally produced in abundance, was considered both medicinal and beautifying. Some said it softened skin. Others claimed it reversed curses. In the background, a man sneezes violently near a spice stall, and someone yells, "Cover your humors." You press on. The medical corner grows stranger still. A woman, dressed in blue with a fur stole around her shoulders, perhaps decorative, perhaps not, stands behind a collection of amulets and dried herbs. Protection from boils, heartbreak, lice, and overzealous leechmen, she says softly. Also cures mild ambition. She offers you a pouch containing dried rose petals and powdered bone. Crush and mix with goat's milk, she says. Apply before breakfast and during eclipses. You decide to pass. Just next to her, 2 vendors, the leechman and the barber surgeon, have now begun a heated argument. She came to me for bloodletting and left with a black eye, the leechman cries. You call that care? You let a leech wander into her nose, the barber surgeon retorts. A crowd begins to gather. The fainting goat is nowhere in sight, sadly. They bicker about technique, about hygiene hilariously, and about who has more satisfied customers. Someone shouts from the crowd, "You both nearly killed my uncle." Both men respond, "Yes, but did he recover?" A priest shows up. "Gentlemen," he says, "perhaps this can be settled with a public diagnosis." "Oh no," a woman whispers beside you. "Not another one of those." Sure enough, a volunteer is selected, a portly butcher with a rash on his arm and a bad attitude. The barber-surgeon examines him, prodding with gloved fingers, muttering excess bile. Likely from pork envy. The leechman disagrees. Clearly spleen melancholy. Look at his eyes, pure fog. The diagnosis duel begins. They debate the color of his phlegm, the pitch of his burps, whether his mood has been influenced by bad turnips. It ends with both of them proposing treatment plans that involve shouting at clouds and burning vinegar-soaked rags under the moon. The butcher walks away and says he'll just eat more garlic. Probably wise. Not all medical vendors are so loud. You pass a quiet table covered in dried herbs and books. A woman reads softly from a leather-bound volume. Lavender for sadness. Valerian for restless legs. Chamomile for when your mother-in-law stays too long. She looks up. We all need healing. A sign behind her reads, "Healer of the quiet sort." You give her a silver and take a small bag of herbs. No instructions, just a nod. As you stroll toward the end of the row, you notice a small wooden box with teeth scratched into the top. Inside are molars, some gold-tipped, some still bloody. A man behind the table shrugs. People leave them behind. I sell them to sculptors. You decide it's time to leave. But before you go, you hear one last offer shouted from a tall man with a scroll and a lopsided grin. Cure-all potions for your blood, your bones, your conscience, and your cousin's limp. You raise a skeptical brow. Only side effect is occasional sudden song. You pause. Does it work? He shrugs. Better than snails. You laugh and keep walking, the scent of mint mustard seed and something very medical lingering behind you. In the medieval market, health was part science, part ritual, and part performance. A leech might save your life or steal your coin. A cream might soothe your skin or summon your ex. And if things got really bad, there was always garlic or snails. As the sun begins to dip low over the thatched rooftops and the last glimmers of afternoon light hit the muddied stones of the market square, a hush of golden calm tries just barely to settle over the chaos. You feel it. That small, rare pause when people start packing up their wares, wiping counters, counting coin, and arguing in slightly softer tones. But don't be fooled. This market isn't done with you yet. In the distance, a strange, rhythmic drumming echoes over the remaining booths. It's fast, like footsteps or hooves. Nope. Sparks fly as a figure strides into view. Barefoot, face-smudged chest, bare despite the chill, and then erupts quite literally into fire. A fire breather, the grand finale of market days has arrived. You join the thickening crowd circling the performance area. There's something primal about it, the way people hush automatically. Children press in closer. Elders lean forward on their sticks. Even the goat. Yes, it's back again, stands at the edge of the crowd, eyes wide and appropriately dramatic. The performer raises a flaming brand, holds it to his lips, and breathes out a glittering arc of fire. Gasps ripple outward. Some people clap. Others step back. One man shouts, "I knew he was a dragon." Fire breathers weren't always welcome in medieval towns. Many were wanderers, performers without permits, suspected of alchemy, devilry, or just dangerously dry humor. A few even faced accusations of sorcery or heresy, because really, what honest man can make his mouth explode and not get arrested for it? Historians still argue whether such performers were tolerated because of their skill or merely because the crowd was too stunned to stop them. What's clear is this fire was fearsome, sacred, and hypnotic, and those who dared to master it were granted a strange, fleeting authority. The kind that makes you part legend, part outlaw. The flames dance one last time as the performer takes a final bow and throws his torch into a bucket. Steam hisses, the crowd cheers, the goat faints. And then, just like that, people begin to drift away. But not you. Something catches your eye. A table. Simple. Unmarked. No elaborate banner. Just a short, smiling man sitting behind it, offering what appears to be property deeds. "Castle," he asks casually, as if he's offering you a warm roll. You tilt your head. "Castle." He nods. "A lovely one, slightly haunted, possibly imaginary, but very defensible." You blink. And you're selling it. Of course, only 5 florins, includes partial drawbridge rights. You take a moment. "Is it real?" He leans in. "That depends entirely on your confidence." The fake deed scam was a well-known part of the more elaborate medieval market cons. Unsuspecting visitors, especially those from far-off towns or villages, could be tricked into buying deeds to non-existent lands, titles to imaginary estates, or even rights to rivers, roads, or saints' bones. Some were written on parchment, so convincing that only when someone went to claim the land did they find it already occupied by sheep and a deeply confused shepherd. You glance at the man's table. Alongside castle deeds are marriage licenses, inheritance vouchers, and one scroll labeled "Claim to the Moon." You pick it up. He winks. "One-time offer." You place it gently back down. Behind you, someone is currently yelling at a chicken vendor. "You said this hen was a direct descendant of Charlemagne." The vendor shrugs. "I said it acted noble." You look around. The last bits of the market are dissolving into twilight. Stalls fold like weary knees. Barrels are rolled. Bread is bagged. A boy sweeps eel scales into a corner with the solemnity of a monk. The goat has revived again and is now wearing a crown made of pastry. There's still a faint hum of mischief. You hear someone whispering about a coin swap scheme. Another merchant quietly rolls away a holy relic crate now clearly filled with chicken feathers. Someone else tucks a jar labeled unicorn breath under his cloak. You pass by the scribe who sold insults earlier. He's now scrawling them into a book titled "Things I Shouldn't Have Said But Did Anyway." He offers to sell you a copy for a groat and your mildest regret. Even now in the fading light, deals are made. Hands are shaken. Bets are settled. And somewhere someone is definitely planning to reappear next week with a new name, a new story, and possibly a monkey in a bishop's hat. Because this is the true soul of the medieval market. Not just the goods, not just the food, the shouting, the fire. It's the constant churn of performance and pretense, the line between survival and spectacle so blurred it's practically decorative. The toothless baker claiming saintly flour. The goat that faints on cue. The goose who polices beer sales. The fake relics. The real eels. The woman with snail cream and the man selling the moon. They all belong here. And now, as the lanterns are lit, the bells toll for evening prayer, and the crowds shuffle toward home, or inn, or alley, you realize something strange. Despite the mud, the scams, the sensory overload, you feel lighter. Like the chaos of it all has washed away something heavier than rain. You watch the fire breather pack up his torches. He glances at you and nods. "See you next week." You smile. Probably. The market fades now. Lanterns swing gently in the breeze, casting soft amber glows that shimmer against puddles and polished stones. The chatter has dwindled to murmurs, traders haggling over storage, friends sharing scraps of meat pie, someone softly strumming a lyre with no particular tune in mind. Even the goat. Yes, our dramatic little friend rests quietly near a shuttered bread stall, its pastry crown slightly askew. You walk slowly, your feet heavy, but your mind oddly still. The air smells of wood smoke, cooling clay, and distant roasting chestnuts. Somewhere, a bell tolls again, its notes drifting lazily across the rooftops like lullabies for the town. You pass the remnants of the pie stalls, now empty save for a few crumbs and a single forgotten turnip. A puddle reflects a sliver of moon, and a sleepy vendor mumbles goodnight to it. The fire-breather's bucket smolders faintly in a quiet corner like a dragon gone to sleep. Oh, even the absurdity of the day seems gentler now. The leechman is packing up in silence. The insult scribe has fallen asleep on his own parchment, and the last pilgrim is offering a prayer to a feather he's not sure is holy. This strange, muddy, miraculous place, you know you'll dream of it. So let your breath slow now. Let your muscles unwind, each one uncoiling like rope released from a cartwheel. Let the background hum of memory settle like ash after a market fire, soft and quiet. There's nothing more to see tonight. The market's asleep, and soon you will be too. You've walked through time, through stories and stalls, through goats and mystery pies and stolen names. And now all that's left is rest. Sleep well, traveler.